A 12-year-old girl pointed at a photo in a museum. They laughed at her. Then Harrison Ford walked in. The photo was quiet. 8 men in black and white, their boots half dusted, their expressions half smiles. It hung behind glass on the museum's west wall, just above eye level. A row of plaques sat beneath it, names, locations, a brief blurb about a fire at Ozan Air Base in 1970. None of that mattered to Mia Wells. She pointed at the third man from the right. "That's my grandpa." She said. The words came out steady, but softer than she'd planned. Maybe she hadn't meant to say them out loud. Maybe she had. The guard, Denton, according to his name tag, didn't look at her at first. He was leaning against the wall, arms folded like he'd been waiting years for a reason to feel smarter than someone. When he finally glanced down, it was with the kind of smirk that made your throat go hot. "Sweetheart, don't embarrass yourself," he said. Not cruelly, not loudly, just, with practiced doubt. "That photo's older than your parents. Maybe next you'll tell me he flew the jet." Someone behind her laughed. Mia didn't look back, but she knew who it was. Brittany, with the two loud whispers and the phone always half raised, just in case something meme-worthy happened. Her teacher, Miss Rayner, stepped closer. "Is this still about your grandfather?" "Mia." Her voice was that tight kind of sweet, the kind people use right before they gut your confidence and walk away smiling. "We all have stories we love to believe." Mia didn't answer. Not at first. Her eyes were on the man in the photo, the one with his collar slightly crooked, one boot turned out, like he wasn't ready for the shot. The smile was faint, but familiar. She remembered it from rainy afternoons and quiet dinners, and the way he said her name like it had weight. She said it again, softer now. "That's him. He told me about this picture." Miss Rayner's expression shifted, just slightly. "Well," she said, glancing at the group, "real history is what's recorded. Let's not get distracted by family tales. Okay, phones were out now. Someone was recording. Someone else whispered. "She's serious," another boy added. "Her grandpa's going to start trending." Mia didn't flinch, but her hands were gripping the edge of the museum guide so tightly the paper had creased into sharp ridges. Denton shrugged. "I've worked here 13 years. I've seen every face in that photo, and none of them are yours. Kid." The class moved on. They always did. Mia stayed. She looked up at the face behind glass, and for a moment it felt like the whole room had gone quiet, just her, a stranger in a frame, and a truth no one believed. Not yet. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The video was 24 seconds long. No editing, no music. Just Mia's voice, the half laugh from the guard, the way her teacher tilted her head, and the exact moment the rest of the class decided it was okay to laugh. By the time the school bus made it back to campus, it was already online. First on a private class thread, then someone posted it to a student-run meme page with the caption, "She thinks her grandpa's in the war wall." It had 3,000 views by dinner, 10,000 by bedtime. One of the boys from 8th period dubbed over the last line with a dramatic string score, turning Mia's voice into a shaky confession just before the cut. Another student added fake subtitles. "My grandpa fought aliens at Area 51. The next morning, Mia walked down the hall, and no one said her name. They didn't have to. A cough turned into a chuckle. Someone whispered, "General Wells reporting for Delusion." A girl at her locker saluted as Mia passed. Brittany filmed it. Of course, by lunch, she was sitting alone. Not at the edge of a group, not a seat away. Alone. Even Caleb, who used to share his headphones with her during reading block, walked past without looking up. He'd helped edit the first video. She hadn't known that yet, but she would. Her tray sat untouched. The mashed potatoes jiggled with every footstep. But she wasn't hungry, just tired. Tired in the kind of way that settles in your chest and makes you feel like you're not breathing wrong. Just less. Like your lungs don't need as much when no one sees you. Across the cafeteria, Brittany was filming a mock interview with her fork. Tell us, Mia, she said, mimicking the teacher's voice, what was it like being raised by Captain America? Some kids laughed. Others just watched. No one stopped it. Miss Rayner walked by. She glanced toward the table, toward Mia, toward the fake news conference happening 15 feet away. She didn't say anything, just walked on. That part might have been worse than the jokes. That night, Mia sat on the floor of her room with the photo in her lap. The crease was deeper now. One corner bent. She didn't try to flatten it. She just looked at the face. The not quite smiling man, the one with his boot turned out. The back of the photo had faint writing. It was hard to read, but still there. Team 12, Ozen, 1970, SSGT Lee Wells. Third from right, below that, in smaller script one she hadn't noticed before. Don't let them crop us out. She traced her thumb across the words and said nothing. The clip wasn't trending nationally, not yet, but it had made its way into strange corners of the internet veteran forums, comment threads beneath museum live streams, low-resolution reposts with laughing emojis. That's where Harrison Ford saw it. He didn't click right away. He wasn't one for viral anything, but the thumbnail caught his eye. Not the girl, though there was something in the posture. The way she stood with her finger lightly pressed to the glass, but the photo behind her. Blurry, cropped, and familiar. He clicked. She said it calmly. That's my grandpa. Her voice cracked a little at the end, but not from doubt, from timing. The laugh came before she'd even finished the sentence. He paused the video. It was grainy, of course, pixelated, but the angle gave him just enough. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, squinting at the photo on the wall. There, just above her shoulder, was the edge of the hanger, a patch of sky, and a face, third from the right. His breath caught in a way that didn't make noise, but still felt loud. He reached across the table for an old leather folder, not the kind you carry for show. This one was sun-warped, the edges cracked, the zipper stubborn. He unzipped it. Inside were papers, some folded, some stained, some too fragile to move. A photo rested beneath a weathered map of Korea, its corners curled like old bark. 8 men, shoulder to shoulder, the Ozen hangar behind them. Third from the right, Lee Wells. Boot turned out, collar slightly off. That half smile that always looked like he was about to say something kind, but wouldn't. Harrison turned the photo over. The handwriting was still clear. Team 12, Ozen AFB, March 1970. SSGT Lee Wells rescued pilot from runway fire. No newspaper had printed it. No metal. Just ink on paper and memory in bone. He sat for a while. The clip was still paused on his screen. Mia's hand hovering. The others around her, just starting to laugh. That look on her face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was the look of someone who knew what they were saying was true and had already accepted no one would believe them. He knew that look. He closed the folder, slowly, then reopened it, slipped the photo inside, and zipped it shut again. Not because he was going anywhere, not yet, but because something inside him had shifted. Not a surge, not a spark, just a click, like an old mechanism long ignored finally sliding back into alignment. He looked back at the screen, pressed play, watched her say it again. That's my grandpa. He nodded once, then stood up. The barn smelled like dust and cedar. It always had. Harrison hadn't opened the back cabinet in years, not since before he stopped flying. It sat behind a stack of old crates, half hidden under a canvas tarp, the kind that held more silence than tools. He pulled it free. The lock was still intact. So was the key, taped behind a loose slat on the adjacent shelf. He turned it slowly, felt the weight of metal click open. Inside layers, folders, clippings, envelopes, some labeled, others left blank because there was no one else to read them. He found the one he was looking for, Ozen, 70. It wasn't a thick file, most weren't. People thought records told stories, but sometimes the stories were too fast, too loud, too smoky to make it onto paper. He sat down on the bench beside the cabinet. No rush. The folder opened to a folded sheet, handwritten notes on aircraft maintenance. Beneath it, a weathered photo. The same 8 men, dust in their boots, jackets uneven, eyes tired but steady. March 12th. He remembered because the air had that weird dryness, the kind that settles into the corners of your lungs like static. They'd been prepping a routine test on a refurbished jet. Nothing complicated until it caught fire. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a burst like something sneezing flame. Then the left tank ruptured. Fuel spilled fast. Wicked across the runway. No sirens. No time. Just reflex. And Lee, he didn't hesitate. No checklist. No protocol. Just ran. He crossed the concrete like it was instinct, not thought. Pulled the pilot out with his bare hands. Burned his left arm, though he never said much about it. Afterward, he wrapped it with a shirt and told the medic, "I'll file it when it matters." It never did. Harrison had been nearby, still strapping into his own chopper when the fire started. By the time he reached the blaze, Lee already had the pilot half clear of the wing. 2 others helped finish the job, but the first set of hands, those were Lee's. No citation, no ceremony. Just a quiet debrief and a replacement patch for a uniform sleeve that got half melted. Harrison reached into the folder again. At the bottom, a circular badge faded blue, rubber ring cracked. Flight Responder Unit 12. The same unit stitched on Mia's grandfather's chest in the photo. The patch barely held together anymore, but he kept it, not because it was official, because it was real. That moment never made it into the logs. But he remembered. The way Lee smelled like burned nylon and aviation fuel. The way he said, "We got lucky," even though they hadn't. They'd just been brave. He looked at the folder, at the photo, then at the badge. They were still here. And maybe it was time someone else remembered too. Harrison didn't rush. He never had, really. Not with things that mattered. Some people move fast when they were angry. He moved deliberately. That was something Lee used to say, "Go fast when it helps. Go slow when it counts." He folded the photo carefully, corner to corner. Not too sharp. Just enough so it fit inside the manila envelope without bending too much. The badge went in next, wrapped in a square of soft cloth. It wasn't pristine, wasn't meant to be. He'd carried it on and off for decades, mostly in storage, but now it needed to go somewhere it could be seen. He sat at the kitchen table as the morning came in, slow through the windows. Sunlight landed across the wood in soft, slanted lines. The house didn't make noise, not anymore. No humming appliances, no morning TV, just the sound of a distant crow and the occasional creak of a beam remembering how old it was. He pulled out a note card, blank, except for a faded watermark in the corner, something he'd gotten in a pack years ago and never used. He wrote with a fountain pen. Something about ink always felt more final than tapping on keys. She remembered, and so did I. That was all it said. No signature, no return address, no need. He slipped the card behind the photo, took one last look at Lee's half-smile, and closed the flap. On the front of the envelope, he printed the name of the school. Under it, the name of the teacher from the clip. It took a minute to remember. Rayner, Miss Rayner, the one who smiled like she already knew what wasn't true. He grabbed his keys, jacket, the envelope. The truck was an old green Bronco with a rattle in the left door he hadn't fixed. The kind of vehicle that didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It started on the second try. Same as always. Gravel crunched as he pulled out of the driveway and onto the long road that passed through oak trees and rusted wire fences. The school wasn't far. 20, maybe 25 minutes. When he stepped inside, the receptionist looked up from her screen, blinked twice, probably didn't recognize him, just a man in a coat, envelope in hand, eyes steady but not loud. I'm here to deliver something, he said. She reached out automatically. No announcement, he added. Just hand it to her. The receptionist nodded, unsure, took the envelope like it might bite. He stepped back into the hallway, leaned against the wall near the old trophy case. It smelled faintly of floor wax and teenage boredom. And then he waited. Not for permission, not for recognition, just for the right moment to follow the truth inside. The envelope reached Miss Raynor's desk during second period. She didn't open it right away. There was something about the weight of it, not heavy, but present, like it hadn't just been delivered, but carried. She stared at the handwriting on the front for a long time before sliding her finger under the flap. Inside a photo, faded but sharp, 8 men, third from the right, unmistakable, and behind the photo, a note card with 7 words she remembered. And so did I. Miss Raynor's hands stilled. She didn't say anything at first, just looked out across the classroom, past the rows of desks and into a silence that hadn't quite arrived yet, but would. She turned toward the hallway, and there he was. Harrison Ford didn't need an introduction. Not here, not now. He stepped into the classroom without ceremony. No dramatic entrance, no declaration, just boots on tile, coat still buttoned, and a stillness in his movement that made everything else seem unnecessarily loud. The class went quiet almost instantly. Mia had been writing something when he entered. Just a few lines, a half sentence in her notebook. She didn't look up at first. Then she did, and froze. Harrison's eyes scanned the room, not searching, not challenging, just taking it in. The desks, the faces, the shape of the space where something had gone wrong. He nodded toward Miss Raynor. She didn't nod back, didn't move at all. He turned to Mia. She was still holding her pen, but now it hovered an inch above the page like it had forgotten what it was for. He spoke softly. I was there. No one replied. Harrison stepped closer. Just a pace, enough to be heard without having to speak up. Ozen Air Base. March 12th, 1970. It was cold that morning. You could feel it in the steel before the sun came up. He looked around, not to impress anyone, but because memory sometimes needed help finding the corners of a room. That photo, he gestured gently. Just once. It's real. That man, Staff Sergeant Lee Wells. He didn't make it up. He didn't tell a story. Mia blinked. Her throat moved like she wanted to swallow something that didn't belong there. Harrison's voice didn't change. He saved a man's life that day, burned his arm to do it, and then went right back to work. No press, no medals. He didn't want attention. He paused, just for a breath. But he did matter. A desk creaked near the back as someone shifted uncomfortably. A paper rustled. No one spoke. Not even the ones who usually did. Harrison looked at Mia again. You remembered, even when no one else did. And Mia, she didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her hand lowered slowly onto the desk. And for the first time since she'd said, "That's my grandpa," the room didn't feel like it was laughing. It felt like it was listening. No one moved. It wasn't a frozen kind of silence. It was heavier than that, the kind that sets into the floorboards, the kind that makes fluorescent lights buzz louder and chairs feel suddenly too small. Harrison stood near the front, just off-center, not behind the teacher's desk, not at the whiteboard, just there, like he'd stepped out of some frame the rest of the room hadn't noticed before. He looked down for a moment, as if reaching for something that wasn't in his hands, but in memory. That morning, he began. We weren't even supposed to be flying. His voice didn't rise. He didn't perform. He didn't need to. The plane had just been refitted. A test run. Routine stuff. Lee was on ground detail that day. Not as usual, but he volunteered. He shifted his weight slightly, eyes somewhere beyond the wall. I was about 50 yards away, sitting in the chopper. We hadn't even spooled up. Then came this sound, not like an explosion, more like pressure cracking, something too big squeezing through something too small. The room stayed still. Even the HVAC hum seemed to fade. I turned and saw the flame trail across the tarmac. Fuel had sprayed under the carriage. Pilot wasn't even fully strapped in. No alarms, no warning. And Lee, he paused. Not for drama, just because some sentences arrived slower than others. Lee didn't freeze. He didn't even hesitate. He looked back at the class. Not one face met his with amusement. Not anymore. He ran. Through it. Through fuel and heat and God. I don't even know if he could see. Just moved like he already knew where the pilot was. One of the students shifted. A breath caught somewhere in the back. He pulled the guy out with bare hands. Burned both arms. The left worse. Tried to go back in to cut the ignition. We stopped him. Another pause. Shorter this time. He said, "No one died, so we're done here." That was it. Didn't file a report. Didn't want recognition. Just bandaged his arm with his shirt and went quiet again. Harrison glanced down. He seemed smaller for a moment, not in stature, but in burden. I didn't know his name the day I saw him run through fire, but I've never forgotten it since. He turned to Mia then. Her hands were flat on the desk now, fingers barely trembling. She looked at him like she wanted to believe it more than anything, but had already believed it so long it had started to ache. He nodded. Just once. That's who your grandfather was. Miss Rayner still hadn't spoken. She looked pale, hollow, and across the room, the kids who had laughed hardest were suddenly quiet in a way they didn't quite understand. Not guilt, not yet. But something had cracked, and something else had stepped into the light. No one spoke. The kind of silence that followed wasn't tidy or reverent. It was uncomfortable, unfinished. The kind that makes you realize too late what you've become part of. Harrison didn't move. He just let the room sit in it. Miss Rayner opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her fingers curled around the edge of her desk, knuckles pale. When she finally found her voice, it was thin and cracked in the middle. I didn't know. She said, I thought she was just. She stopped. The sentence didn't want to finish. Harrison didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Instead, he glanced toward Mia. Most truth, he said softly. Sounds like a story until someone proves they lived it. Mia didn't blink. Her eyes had gone glassy, but not from tears, from something harder to name. Not relief, not vindication. Maybe just the exhale that never came. At the back of the room, a boy shifted in his seat. Bryce, the one who'd clapped near the water fountain, the one who'd shouted General Wells down the hall. His arms were crossed now, but it looked less like defiance and more like he didn't know where else to put them. A girl, Brittany, lowered her phone slowly into her lap. The screen was black. For once, she wasn't filming. Harrison let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as instruction, like the quiet itself had become the point. He walked between the rows of desks, not slowly, not with purpose. Just walking, like the air hadn't moved right in this room for too long, and he needed to remind it how. I'm not here to make anyone feel bad, he said as he passed. I'm here because when memory gets mocked, it stops showing up. He paused near a desk, eyes on no one in particular. You think bravery looks like noise, like medals, like someone shouting over the sound of applause. But real bravery, he looked toward Mia again. Looks like a girl standing in front of a photo while the rest of the world laughs. Another pause. That one hung longer. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't shout. She didn't bring files or flags or facts. She just pointed and said, "That's my grandpa." He turned back to the room, and the truth didn't change. You just didn't listen. At the front, Miss Rayner sat down without meaning to, like the ground beneath her had stopped asking for balance. No one touched a phone. No one whispered. And in that stillness, somewhere between regret and recognition, the room shifted. Not loudly, but completely. The clip went up before the school day ended. It wasn't slick. No edits, no music. Just raw footage from a ceiling-mounted security camera in the classroom, muted at first, then fading in, just as Harrison Ford said, "You think bravery looks like noise?" The moment he placed the photo in Mia's hands gently, as if it were glass in memory, at once that frame alone spread faster than the original Humiliation ever had. By midnight, it had crossed 200,000 views. By morning, it was everywhere. But something was different this time. They didn't lead with his name, they led with hers. 12-year-old girl's quiet truth restores a soldier's legacy. She remembered trended before noon. First it was classmates, some anonymous, some not posting apologies without tags, without excuses. Then came the Ripple veterans reposting the photo, teachers sharing the video in homerooms, grandchildren uploading snapshots of folded letters and dust-covered medals. Stories once tucked in drawers started surfacing. A boy in Chicago filmed himself reading from his grandfather's war journal. A girl in Texas held up a nursing pin from her great-grandmother's time in Da Nang. One student wrote, "We laughed at her. Turns out she carried more history than all of us." Even Brittany returned to her feed. No filters, just her, in her backyard, holding a photo of her grandfather in uniform, leaning against the hull of a ship. "I used to call him old school," she said, eyes unsteady. "I never asked him anything real. I should have." She didn't mention Mia by name. She didn't have to. At the museum, the photo on the west wall came down. Not permanently, just long enough for them to replace the cropped version with the full one. Reframed, recentered, better light, new plaque underneath Team 12, Ozen Air Base, 1970. Verified by Harrison Ford. Vietnam Air Rescue Division restored to full credit in 2025. And below that, in smaller script, copied from the back of the original photo, "Don't let them crop us out." People stopped walking past it now. They lingered. Some took pictures. Others just stood still. One girl, maybe 10, maybe younger, pointed at the man third from the right and said quietly, "He looks like my uncle." No one laughed. Back at school, the whispering changed. Not silence, just something softer. No more nicknames. No more museum girl. Even Bryce had stopped filling the space with noise. He passed Mia in the hallway once and didn't speak. Just looked down. The way people do when they've seen something they can't unsee and aren't quite sure what to do with it yet. Mia didn't walk faster. Didn't look down. She didn't carry the photo anymore. She didn't have to. It was framed now, just inside the front office, behind clean glass. And beneath it, a simple line, donated by a student who remembered what history forgot. The lights above the auditorium were soft, not stage bright, just warm enough to feel like early morning in a quiet room. Rows of chairs stretched out in neat, imperfect lines, students, teachers, parents, a few veterans in the front. Some wore medals, most didn't. At the back of the stage, a banner hung wide but modest, Youth Voices Forum, honoring memory, restoring truth. Mia Wells stood at the podium. She wasn't dressed up, just a plain white blouse and jeans, her hair tied back, same as every other day. No makeup, no handlers, just her and a single page, folded once, resting beneath her fingertips. Behind her, a screen showed the photo clear now, fully restored. 8 servicemen, boots grounded in gravel, jackets creased, eyes halfway between tired and proud. Third from the right, Staff Sergeant Lee Wells. The auditorium was silent, not nervous, not formal, just waiting. Mia looked down at the page, then up. "When I saw the photo at the museum," she began, "I didn't think anyone else would care. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just knew what I knew." Her voice was steady, small, but never uncertain. "I remember how my grandfather said the name Ozen, like it was a place that followed him, not a place he left behind. He never made it sound heroic, just necessary." She paused, like she was checking whether the next sentence still made sense outside her own head. I didn't expect to be believed, but I didn't expect to be erased either. Somewhere in the middle rows, someone shifted in their seat. Not a distraction, just weight changing shape. I didn't tell that story because it made me important. I told it because someone had to. Mia unfolded the page slowly, smoothed it once with her palm, didn't look at it again. My grandfather didn't want medals. He never asked for his name to be in books, but he saved someone. And he remembered that day every time he looked at the scar on his hand. She looked toward the crowd now. I thought if I didn't say it, maybe no one else ever would. In the third row, Harrison Ford sat still, no spotlight, no press, just his posture upright, quiet, and listening. He once told me, Mia said, voice softening, that a plane could lose a wing and still land if the pilot remembered what mattered. She smiled faintly, just for a breath. I think memory works the same way. A beat passed, no applause, no rustle, just the slow gravity of realization settling into the room. Then a voice somewhere near the back, older, clear. It does. People began to stand, not all at once, not loud, but steady. A wave of acknowledgement, not celebration. Mia didn't cry. She stepped back from the podium, and the world, for once, didn't look away. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.